Right, well, the winter break is now officially over because the politicians have all arrived back in Canberra for the first sitting week since Parliament got up 5 and a bit weeks ago. A big debate is underway over drug testing of welfare recipients, with Jackie Lambie having opposing positions for it and now against it in less than 24 hours. Plus, news poll, as I've said, low days for Labor. Joining me now to get through all of these important issues and the political headlines of today, political editor at the Australian newspaper, Dennis Shanahan. Dennis, great to have your analysis back here on Monday, as always. Now that Parliament's back, it's even more interesting, the dynamics, particularly with this news poll, tell us a lot, and you could see it in the confidence levels, I think, in question time today. What did you make of the return to Parliament, and what did you make of news poll?
Well, I think that the return to Parliament on a rather cool spring day in Canberra was pretty much as you would expect. Very confident government. Scott Morrison, Josh Frydenberg, although under pressure on the economy, that is in the real world, facing very little pressure from Labor. They're able to turn Labor's inadequacies on policies and, of course, the huge election loss back against it. They didn't even, today, Labor didn't even ask a question about the Tamil family that last week was of such importance that Anthony Albanese had to go to Queensland to talk about it on the day the national accounts came out. No, Labor's in trouble because it still hasn't worked out why it lost the election, and it hasn't worked out what to do about that and what policies to keep and which ones to throw out. So at the moment, they're in a vacuum, they're in a policy vacuum. People are starting to have different views. We've seen Wayne Swan and Mark Butler, protagonists for the ALP presidency, fighting it out. Wayne Swan saying, let's hold on to the tax and spend measures and hold on to Labor values, while Mark Butler is saying, no, everything's got to come under the axe. So it's going to be a very tough time as Parliament continues for the next couple of weeks for Labor, because they don't have an anchor, they're easily distracted, and they're not putting any pressure on the government where the pressure needs to be applied, and that's on the economic management.
Yeah, I'll just get to some of the other social issues, because it's quite a big social agenda that the government's going forward with this week. Welfare, of course, drug testing and other things. I'll get to that, as I said, in a moment. But I want to pick up your point about the economy, and you're absolutely right. There is no tension for the government with the opposition across the chamber on economic issues. That really is the government in daylight. Now, that's a concern. I am surprised that in opposition, as a way to manage themselves through this policy flux period where they're working out from the last election what they will keep and what they will junk, that they haven't, Labor, announced some level of process for an inquiry or a chair of a policy committee, let's say, a way to give them breathing space. Because right now, backed in by Wayne Swan, now the national president of the ALP on Friday, everything they took to the election, according to Swan, should stand. And it's unclear then where Labor goes with the questions that they're getting from journalists and others on all sorts of issues. Are they sticking with what they took to the election a couple of months ago? Is it off the table? Is it on the table? Is it in limbo? Are they thinking about it? They certainly haven't got an answer, and the questions are coming thick and fast.
Well, of course, there is a policy review or a review of where we went wrong, including Craig Emerson and so, who are looking at it. But look, and I think Wayne Swan wasn't actually saying, oh, let's hold on to everything. But what he's trying to do is hold on to the good bits of the policy. Look, there were good parts of the Labor policy. For instance, on negative gearing, Scott Morrison, as Treasurer, said that there should be changes to the top end of the negative gearing to wipe out excesses from negative gearing, which were costing the public money through tax exemptions. Now, that was what Scott Morrison felt as Treasurer. There is an argument for doing that. But because of the way in which Labor prosecuted this case during the election campaign and didn't allow for any change, any flexibility at all, once the housing market started to get into a bit of bother, it should have been able to say, oh, well, look, our changes to negative gearing will now be delayed, they'll be toned down, whatever. but because of the huge promises, the huge costs of the promises that Bill Shorten was making on a daily basis, there was no room to reduce any of the taxation revenue that Labor needed to fund those promises. Now, I think that we saw during the after the Hawke-Keating years, Labor made a big mistake and threw out a lot of the Hawke-Keating economic legacy. They turned on it and said, no, it didn't work, and what I think Wayne Swan's trying to do here is hold on to some of the good parts of Labor policy and the good parts of Labor value. But in this vacuum, nothing's working. I mean, Mark Butler is talking about, oh, we need to have a look at climate change. But yet we already know that various groups and vested interests who are pushing the climate change line, the renewable line, the soft inner left line, are actually trying to say, oh no, it wasn't the policies that were a problem on climate change, it was the way Bill Shorten sold them. Well, that may have been true, but it also makes it sound like some of the climate change policies are indeed sacrosanct. So Labor is all over the place here, and it's being reflected in the polls. Anthony Albanese was all over the place last week on the Tamil family and offshore processing, border protection. He's going to suffer those uncertainties about Labor are going to damage Anthony Albanese.
Yeah, and I'm looking, let's go back to this issue of the social agenda the government's pushing on with this week. There's a clear strategy from the government. While it's got its foot on Labor's throat, it intends to keep it there. You've got a return of a bill that's been rejected twice under Bill Shorten in relation to mandatory sentences for online child sex abusers. You've got a return of the drug testing for welfare recipients. That matters back again, and we'll get to Jackie Lambie in a moment, but also an extension of the cashless welfare card. Now, all of these are divisive issues inside the Labor caucus, very much the same model that Labor used back against Malcolm Turnbull, putting issues that were difficult for the coalition party room on the agenda and debated those issues. But this is going to be problematic for a leader from the left to find his way through, because I think most of those three policies in broad terms would be supported by the community.
I think that's right, Peter, and we've already seen on the drug testing, Labor is saying, look, we can't accept the policy of drug testing. And what they're doing cleverly, I mean, and also curiously, the examples that Labor spokesmen are giving on why they can't support drug testing for people on welfare is that what about somebody who's over 55? What about a nurse who has worked her life and is now looking for a job? She's more than 55 and she's going to be humiliated by having to face to pee in a cup, as they say. Now, that's a completely different line of those, for those over 55 that Labor was pursuing during the election campaign and completely alienated the over 55s. So it seems to be a bit of an incredible switch here. But as well, the other social issues, and in a way the Tamil family is part of that. Christina Keneally was running the line that, let them stay, and it started to soften. And for Anthony Albanese then facing these issues about Medivac, the return of people to Nauru who are allowed to come out because the doctors say so, these are all very divisive issues for the Labor Party. And during the week, last week, Scott Morrison told his New South Wales Liberal Council that they had plenty of wedges to go in against Labor. Anthony Albanese tried to turn that against Scott Morrison today and accused him of just playing politics, that he came up with more wedges than drivers. He wasn't actually doing the good thing and driving things. All he was interested in was wedges.
Let me just jump in on that wedges point. I think this is where Anthony Albanese would have a leg to stand on if these were all new areas. But, of course, these are returns of policies that the coalition has previously had on the table many times and rejected by Labor many times. So a wedge is usually something designed to change the conversation, a new card, if you like, to throw on the table. These are long-standing ideological positions of the centre-right.
That's right, and look, we've just had an election, for goodness sake, and the coalition was elected on a fairly tough policy on various issues, particularly border protection, but others, and an austerity measure, not huge tax cuts rather than tax increases, little spending, and yet Labor is going for these areas, these soft social areas, because they think that, well, they're wedded to them ideologically. And so the coalition can bat them away. Scott Morrison can bat them away because he still has the authority of an election campaign run on many of these issues and for which Labor has still not adjusted its position.
All right, I want to ask you about a policy issue that's been a really slow burn, but it is now becoming, I think, a great difficulty for the coalition, and it's a difference, a long-standing difference of opinion between the National Party and many inside the Liberal coalition. And this is the issue of water. A long time ago in the Howard years, basically, when Malcolm Turnbull was Water Minister, the right to water on a piece of land, a farmer's property, was disconnected, so the land could be owned and the water right, or the entitlement, sold off. It's got to the point where there's foreign entrants, corporates, people with no connection to the land other than money making who've got involved in this country with the trading of water, and some of the futures for water are up to $800 in terms of a megalitre. That's the long-term average, when they're about $135 a megalitre now. So the speculation of water going into a hot summer is causing a lot of concern with farmers, clearly, but it's stagnating and, in fact, hastening the demise of a lot of country towns. People are not thinking that they'll irrigate crops anymore, Dennis, or winemakers are not thinking that they can afford to keep wines in some of these regional areas where perhaps they have before. How is the government? This is an unexploded bomb for the government. How are they going to manage this issue, and is David Littleproud up to it?
Well, you're dead right, Peter. This is a huge issue in the bush. The basic fact here is that Riverina grape growers are actually looking at spending more on water than they can get for their grape juice to make into wine. This is absurd, and it has been coming for a very long time. The separation of the right to buy water for the future market, to try and stabilise the market, but to split it away from people who actually are on the land and use the water, puts it into the hands of carpetbaggers, people who can then make money, and they don't have to use the water. They've got the rights. They can send up the price, and they also can hold over these water rights from one season to the next. Now, a farmer who buys water to try and, in advance, to try and have his water available, his water rights available, isn't going to hold over the water to the next year. He has to use it in that year. And so this is a fundamental issue in the bush. And of course, it's linked with building of dams, drought proofing, and it has been an issue in the bush for years now. This is a very slow burn, but water prices in the bush are the rural equivalent of power prices in the cities. Not only the fact that rural areas get hit with the power prices as well, but this is an issue which has to be addressed by the government. Now, Scott Morrison has tried and he's gone out, he's talked about all the dams they're planning, the $100 billion in infrastructure down the 10-year pipeline, a lot of that is about water. But there has to be something done, and David Littleproud, as the Agriculture Minister, is the man in the hot seat who is going to have to try and do this, and he's going to have to. Now, the National Party, of course, will be accused of, not being free marketeers and going into protectionism and all the rest, but what they have to do is intervene here and say the market on water is getting out of hand. It is actually somewhere where the market is working against the national interest and the interest of the people who actually use the water and produce the food and the goods which are our strength and our exports, and they still are, still providing jobs and life for country towns. Water It's basic, and it is a mightily important political issue in the bush, and one the government needs to get on top of. Otherwise, we'll see a further rise of One Nation and the other independent parties in rural areas campaigning on water retention, water drought proofing and so forth. This is a very slow but big burn for the government.
Yeah, 100% agree, Dennis, and I think that just like carbon tax schemes were joined up by the bankers and others to make money, a long way removed from the actual environmental causes that perhaps they espouse. I think water is exactly the same. It should never have been disconnected from the land. I think that was, you know, a bad mistake, and it's been compounded ever since. So now's the time to get it right. Dennis Shanahan, as always, thanks for your time tonight.